It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight. Where is he? Dr. Richard Hagerty. I first met him in 1994 when I took a job at the medical university, and I thought, this is going to be the most boring government job ever, until I walked into the Division of Plastic Surgery and I saw paintings like this. As a dream worker, I felt immediately at home. I didn't have a lot of interaction with Duke during those years, but I do remember he was one of the kindest surgeons that I worked with there. In researching for my introduction, I found a lot of articles. I encourage you to Google him if you don't know him well. But I decided just to go with some brief descriptive phrases because I want to hear what he has to say. So, Richard Hagerty, MD, American surrealist. The oldest of 5, born at Duke University, thus the nickname. Grew up on Legree Street in a family of intellectuals and achievers. Lifelong dyslexic. Art was a language he could understand. Self-taught painter since high school, now over 40 years of work. Numerous exhibits. Piccolo Spoleto poster artist 5 times. Beautiful book documenting his painting career. Married to childhood friend and muse Barbara. Father of 4, now grandfather. Studied at Johns Hopkins, Duke Medical, Emory for plastic surgery, and studied Jung in a psychiatry rotation. Accomplished plastic surgeon, over 30 years at MUSC and in private practice, 9 years as chair of MUSC's plastic surgery division. 8 volunteer trips abroad, teaching surgical technique and performing cleft palate surgeries. Civil servant. 4-year term as Charleston City Council person from 96 to 99. Board chair of Gun Sense Charleston, an organization devoted to responsible gun ownership. It's a lot. And I could say a lot more. Who is that guy? I could say a lot more, but last year a few of us who are on the board of the Jung Society ran into Duke at a regional dream conference in Greenville. We immediately asked him if he would consider speaking to CJS, and he said, oh, I've already got the presentation. What we didn't know is that he was bringing the band, and I ask you to help me welcome our rock star of the evening, Duke Hagerty.
Am I on, Larry? Oh, good. Okay.
Before you get started.
Yeah, sure.
There's been a lot going on campus here. What kind of car?
That's behind me in the handicap parking spot.
Nissan Sentra in the handicap spot back behind the church. Great. Okay. Once again.
Should I wait? No. All right. Betsy, thank you. And I want to thank Chris and Betsy for all their hard work in organizing this event. I want to make it real clear, this is not a lecture about Jung. My goal is to share my lifelong acquaintance with Jung through art and surrealism. And I know it's a journey shared by many of us in this room, and that's why we're here. All right, here's a test. Okay, what happened? Here. Anyway, so I really appreciate everybody coming, and everybody who knows me, you know, I'll come on and I'll have some basic facts and things, but I'm a Hagerty, and there's a lot of BS in our collective conscious archetype, and so I just forewarn you about that. If you ask me to defend any of these slides, I'm not. So there, we'll do that. Anyway, all right, this still isn't helping. Okay, sorry, Betsy. Anyway, So we're going to talk a little bit about Jung and surrealism. And surrealism is basically, it's the normal with surprise. And that's the definition of surreal. And what it does, we'll put a symbol or a shape or something that's you wouldn't expect to surprise you. And that's what surrealism is, so you will appreciate what's in front of you. Now, Jung, and we're going to talk a little bit about Jung, but again, this isn't a lecture about him. But the biggest takeaway, beyond all the collective unconscious archetypes and all the other things that we can talk about, this statement is what attracted me the most to Jung. The self-development of the individual. The self-development of the individual is the supreme goal of all psychological endeavors. So, and I took that to heart, and that's then my journey with Jung is taking responsibility for my own development. All right, we've already covered that. All right, this is me. Charlotte gave me this. This is a portrait of me as a kid. And we're growing up on 10.5 LaGree Street. And this is where we grew up in Charleston, down on 10.5. And that first floor was my first tabula rasa. That's where I did all my first drawings. And my parents said, you know, maybe we should try to get him to do it on paper and try to get me to go to art school. I was diagnosed with dyslexia late and made life very difficult for everybody around me in the first decade or so of life. But the problems that cause are now a gift. And a person with dyslexia just sees life differently. And particularly in 3 dimensions and in the art world. And so art became my language. Art is my language rather than English. I grew up in a Catholic household, and we had all the good things and a lot of the bad things, and so we talked a lot, and the church and Maru's job is to pray for me every day, and thank goodness. So this is what I thought church should be, and I was very disappointed when this was the reality. And just a quick story, Father Duffy, we were in confirmation class, and we had to pass a test, and you had to make a 70 on the test, and there were about 40 or 50 in the room. And of course, they all passed, and I got a 30. And I was the only one. And Father Duffy went around, they had a raffle for a crucifix. Guess who won? I did. And only a couple years ago did I realize it was a fix. What he did was he said that it was a sign from God that I would be confirmed, and so I went on, and I went throughout my life thinking that that was all chance, but of course it wasn't. This was my first real mentor, Miss Laura Bragg, who's dear to a lot of us around Charleston, and she introduced me to Hieronymus Bosch at the same time I was being confirmed. And she did a very interesting thing, and with that white hair and all that, and I thought she was going to die any minute, and for a little 10-year-old to be around someone that old. And she looked at me, and she asked me, do I believe in God? And for a 10-year-old, that's a toughie, and I just said, yes. And she laughed. And she laughed to make me think about what I was saying. And I guess that really started my interest in a lot of these themes. Then I went on and got interested in the French Impressionists, so on. Rousseau is probably my favorite after Hieronymus. And then I got to medical school, and medical school was a shock. They wanted me to do what? And I was the hardest I'd ever had to work. Barbara and I were married then. I pretty much lived in the closet. And but I was introduced to Jung through a professor there very early, and he suggested that I start painting my dreams. And I said, well, what dreams? And he said, just start and it'll come. And then the dreams started coming. And a lot of us think we don't dream or don't pay attention to it. And it's just a matter of being aware like anything else. And then once you're aware, you can't stop it. I mean, it's just a flood that opens, and the trick is to pay attention to them. And Justina and Chris could tell you all about that. Now we're going back to Jung, and Jung and I shared interesting mothers. This is Jung's mother, Emily, and she was probably, she had a lot of, I don't know whether it was schizophrenia or manic depressive or whatever, but Jung was terrified of her, so was his father. She would wander around at night, and Jung as a child had visions of her walking around with her head in her arms. So can you imagine your mother like that? And that because of that, Jung's father, who was a preacher, had to move often. And but anyway, and again, I don't want to get too much into the basis of Jung, but I think it's important, and it's always a good to just review this, because this really is important. Jung is not, Freud's interpretation of dreams came out in 1899, and Jung was after that, and he was the first time Jung and Freud met, they met for like a 24-hour conversation, a famous scene. And then, like a lot of teacher-student relationships, there was a huge falling out. And basically the falling out was, Freud, as you know, everything was about sex, and I sort of agree with Freud. But anyway, but Freud was very much, it was the ego, the superego, and everything that you're aware of, but it was also the conscious and the unconscious. And everything in the unconscious this war was fought in the unconscious to resolve sexual whatever. Jung was the first one to write about it eloquently. He's not, there have been people talked about this, but he was the first one to bring up the concept of the collective unconscious, that there are archetype symbols that are common to all civilizations, and they go back hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of years. And these are the archetypes that come up, and we're going to talk more about that through our DNA, that are common to all of us, and that's that commonality. Freud had nothing to do with that, and there was a huge breakup of that. Freud thought that dreams were all just expressed sexual problems and whatever repressed, and as opposed to Jung, that he was talking about the collective unconscious. And then the difference in religion. Freud was very much the opiate of the people, and whereas Jung was very much more metaphysical. You know, he was interested in alchemy, he was interested in Ouija boards, and his sister and so on. They had this whole rich life of this other world, and the famous basement of his in his house and so on. And he just sort of segued that into religion and so on, and made it a much richer feeling. And then the real break was when the definition of the libido, where Freud just said it was all about sex, and Jung just made it clear, no, it's not all about sex. It's a lot about sex, but it's also about a lot of other things. And then the interesting thing is that this had a lot of repercussions when World War II broke out with the fascism and so on. And you can imagine the fascists took advantage, just like they did of Nietzsche and others. They would take a segment and say that Jung was actually a fascist, because what he basically said and stood by it was that people are different. Peoples are different. People have different cultures, but they share a common archetype. And then Freud being Jewish and so on, it led to a lot of problems and a lot of criticism, unfairly really, of Jung later. But you can see how this could all be misinterpreted and used. But let's get back to dreams. And so that's where I started painting. It was from dreams, and using that as the material. And basically, I don't need a whole dream. All I need, when I go to a movie, all I need is one frame of that movie. And from that frame, I can make a painting. And then over months and even years, the painting will reveal itself to me, what the meaning is. So I'm really not that interested the professionals like Justina and Robert and Chris and Betsy, the analysis of the dreams, that's one thing. But, I'm a hack. I'm much just more interested in the images. But you can see the common archetypes that I started out with. And this is the classic train going down the trestle out of control, and it's going to have a bad end. And there are monkeys throwing tomatoes at him and so on. And that's me in the front of the train car there. So that's how that started. And then you have these dreamscapes. So these are watercolors done when I first started back in the 70s. And then it's interesting how the dreams evolved. This is a classic dream that we all have as the power symbol, the rhinoceros, bull, whatever. And the rhinoceros was in a recurrent dream. And when I first started dreaming and paying attention, that was me hiding behind the tree here, and I'm hiding from the rhinoceros. And then over the years, many years later, I become the rhinoceros. And then this is my daughter riding on my back with a knife, just killing me, and that's her suitor. So I'm being replaced. The old. So that's what the dreams do, and you just use it and go with it, and don't try to get too heavy into it. But but it's fun stuff, I think. But anyway, and then this is the other thing that is interesting is that you will get dreams that you have no idea where they come from, and they come down from the unconscious, the deep. There's something alive in those dreams other than myself, other than the ego. There's a dream person in there that can help. But not only that, but you can go back thousands of years. And this is a dream that I had, and it's basically the Lascaux Caves. And then you can see the splitting up of like the piano, but actually these are chromosomes just like the DNA would split up. And then there are a lot of fractals and so on, and we'll get into that. But the point being is that I just get out of the way and let these images come up. This is a dream about Charleston 10 years ago, the sea level rising. You can see the sea coming in from here, the ocean swampiness, and we're just not paying any attention. We're eyes are covered, and all this is going on. And then up top, it's sort of like Nero, but that's a Carolina parakeet that's extinct with a little Nero up there, playing the fiddle while everything is going to hell. All right, so that's my interpretation of our flooding here in Charleston. All right, but anyway, and then this is, again, the cosmos is in the belly of the rhinoceros, and the dreamer is here, and this was a dream. And then this is my favorite painting that I've ever done, and this is just right out of a dream, a bull that has all the skin removed, and he's got canvas nailed around his eyes, but the idea is that this is on the other side, and I'm on the other side of those eyes as in my universe, but this is the universe on the other side. All right, and then we're going to talk a little bit. We're going to go back to Jung, and Jung. This is out of the Red Book. And he had this dream his name is the Philemon, and the Philemon would appear. He's appeared in multiple dreams to him, and he gave Jung superior insight. The interesting thing is that there was a similar person in Milton in Paradise Lost. When Milton wrote Paradise Lost, is that most famous poem of Adam and Eve, he was totally blind. He was, at the last years of his life, just totally isolated. And Urania would appear to him at night and dictate to him the poem. And then he redictated it the day to some scribe. And that's how, that's the story about Milton. And these are lucid dreams that both of these share. And I'm sure Chris and Justina could tell you a lot more about this, but lucid dreaming is real, and what it means is that when you're in a dream and you can realize that you're in a dream, and then all of a sudden everything changes. You don't control it, but you're aware of things and you can move around in the dream, and it's a very powerful situation. And these dream people will come to you, and you can ask them questions. You may not like sometimes their answers, they're so honest, but it comes from deep down in the psyche, and that's where the psyche that Jung was talking about is really coming from this lucid dreaming. And this, what it really gets down to is there's something beyond ourselves in these dreams. And they absolutely need to be paid attention to. And I occasionally, I used to be better at it, and I'm trying to work on it again, but it takes me a lot of work to get to that point. But it's well worth it. And painting will be given to me. They'll be just literally given to me. And it's shocking to go through that. All right, but anyway, let me talk a little bit about the creative process and what I do. The big thing, and Jung talks about exactly this in the Red Book, and who was the people writing about him. And he says, get out of the way. Get the ego out of the way, and then let the unconscious come up, or the collective unconscious come up, and then be aware of it, and then that is what you should be painting about, or whatever. And the other point that Jung says is take big risk, and what he meant though was take big risk in dreams. And the modern analysis of dreaming now is that there's a lot of conflict resolution in dreams, and that is the place to take the risk because it's safe. And so when you have an opportunity in a dream to open that door, and you think the lion's on the other side, that's the time you open the door, and you'll find the lion will be that big, or be somebody else. And so it teaches you to always open those doors. So through meditation and so on, when I get ready to paint, I try to get in the right mood and let these images come to me. Of course, most of them come at 3 o'clock at night, much to my wife's chagrin. But anyway, the other point I want to make is the real information is not in front of you. The stuff you really got to pay attention to, it's in the shadows. It's on the edges. The light in front of you is pretty much obvious, and we get attracted to that light. But to really get down and to get some interesting stuff, look at the edges. The irony is that's exactly what fractals do. That's what chaos theory is all about, and quantum, and we'll get into that. But so the irony is that that's what the great thinkers have been doing all along. Now, I do have guidelines. I have colors that I use and how I combine them, but there are no rules. I mean, just to have a rule is enough to make you do it just to break it. And then, but there are a couple little things that are fun. I mean, you'll see me use a cloud and a tree and a lake, and these are all the same shape. They're just different sizes. The brain loves stuff like that. And it likes a third, it likes rectangles, and it likes triangles. See these three? That makes a triangle, and then these things make it. So you have intersecting triangles. The brain loves that kind of stuff. And this has been all well worked out. And The Age of Insight is a great book to look at that, and George can tell you about that. But anyway, so here's what happens. I start just doodling. That's a good place to start. And doodles are good because you're out of the way. You don't care. And that's a good basis. And so you get out of the way, and then you start doodling more, and then you all of a sudden you figure out that's what I've been drawing. And these are the archetype fertility goddesses from Germany 40,000 years ago. The one on the right is from Germany. The one on the left is African. They're the same thing. And these are the archetype fertility goddesses that have been found everywhere in this world. So then I use that as a just play with the imagery, these fertility goddesses, and then develop it a little bit more. And then I'll take that and then make a painting out of it, and that's that painting over there on the wall. And basically, again, just to show you that I do what I say I do, is that you see the clouds up here, those are the same shapes, and they're brain-like. And then the three faces, this is my granddaughter Scout and Moreau, and then this is Petrov. And so that makes a triangle. So these are triangles within triangles. So I know what I'm doing from the composition to get the viewer interested in a very unconscious way. Colonel Petrov is the guy who in 1984 or 83, he was the guy who was sitting in the Russian command center for nuclear response with the button, and his job was to push the button if there was a nuclear attack from the United States. 4 ships, rockets appeared on the screen. And needless to say, he had one of those moments. And he had to make a decision whether he would punch the button that would send 1,000 into the world back for retaliation or not. And he said, well, why would the United States attack with just 4? And so he delayed, and it turned out there was a reflection off the sun on the radar, and that's how close we came. He ended up, for that behavior, in some far little gulag raising potatoes from a windowsill. But if that guy hadn't done what he'd done, and this is a celebration of his life, that painting is a celebration of his life. So this is how the painting works. You start with that and it evolves. All right, now let's get back to Jung. Jung was actually quite religious, and somebody asked him, did he believe in God? And he just looked at him and said, just leave. And of course. And Christ did not simply teach what was knowable and worth knowing, Christ lived it. And I've been very interested in the Stations of the Cross, being raised a Catholic. And one of my fonder memories of the church was on Good Friday. We'd do stations, and I got to hold the crucifix, and there was smoke, and it had all the stuff. It was very dramatic. And I'm the only one who spells Nietzsche without an S, but anyway, that's peculiar to me. But suffering makes sense only if it has meaning. And you can withstand about anything if you know there's a reason for it. And then also, going back, Nietzsche said that the only Christian that ever lived died on the cross. And I think that's a pretty good statement. But anyway, so I did this whole Stations of the Cross. And basically, there are 14 stations. I'd love to give a talk about that sometime, and just the history of the stations and so on. But anyway, I use the Stations of the Cross as a metaphor for universal suffering and how we deal with it. Many suffers, Christ did every day, again and again. In the end, we have to recognize our own suffering before we can be empathetic to the suffering of others. And so in this painting, I think this number 5, this woman here is an image I saw in a camp in Cambodia 2 years ago. And she was brutally murdered by Pol Pot. And these were some flowers that were growing in the yard. And so she's, to me, a Christ-like figure like anybody else. Then also you can see this is actually a woman who's Christ, and you can know that's Christ because of the 888s. This is Simon helping Christ. So I use different images for Christ. And then this is a show in New York that's going on now, and I would love it if you're in New York in the next couple of months to go by there. This is at St. Peter's? Peter's, thank you. We had a great party there. But anyway. All right, so you dogs don't know anything about scripture verses. You don't know anything about grace or baptism or Moses or anything. That's right. Theologically, we're off the hook. And I feel a little bit like artists are off a little bit too, but my relationship is personal. And I have no interest in telling anybody what they should think. I go right back to that first slide, that this is an individual journey, and it's for all of us to walk and to figure it out ourselves. Betsy, do you want to take a break and then get it, because it'll sound a lot better if they have some wine, and then we can come back? You want to let's take a 5-minute break, and then we'll move on.
It might be hard to take 5.
All right.
Want to do like 15 so get up and get back?
Okay, all right, 10. How about 10? I'll be hard on them. Okay, I'm going to get started again. And we're all familiar with that, how you think, that old adage, how you think determines what you think. I'm a real firm believer in that. And I really have to be careful about what I'm thinking. And if it's not proper, I got to get rid of it. And that's a huge problem, and it's a huge challenge for me. But it's all part of this process. And then knowledge. I like to break knowledge down to sort of Kantian into logic, the intellect, and then the intuition. And if somebody asks me if I believe in God, from my head, Kant would say, it's impossible for anybody to prove the existence of God. But from my heart, intuitively, I feel a presence. And that's a personal experience. I'm not saying everybody has that or should have it or anything. That's not the point. It's just what my a priori experience is. And then Sheridan is my queen of Kierkegaard. And she's just written all these books about Kierkegaard and got me a lot more interested in it. But this is a painting about Kierkegaard. And he's driving the chariot. And the old horse represents mortality, and Pegasus represents immortality. And the question is how you balance that. And Kierkegaard is in the wagon. And you can see, when he was in Copenhagen, I mean, he just made everyone uncomfortable, because, and particularly the Christians, because he was so hard on them. And then, because he was much more. And he was really the first existentialist. He was the first one to think, why am I here? Not why are we here, but why am I here? And so I'm a big fan of his, and thank you, Sheridan. All right, science. Science is, and I have a big science background, and basically science's job is to identify patterns, recurrent patterns, and then figuring out relations between those patterns. And then the second is to passing that information so that it has some value later on. So this is Singularity, a big painting, and you can see it's got a lot of patterns that repeat itself, has a lot of fractals, and then there's a lot of chromosomes with the idea of passing on information and so on. Then one of the biggest questions is the structure of the world arising out of an undirected process, or is it directed by intelligence? And it's, when Einstein was asked that, and they asked him, do you believe in God? He famously said, I believe in Spinoza's God. And Spinoza was famous for saying, God may have existed, but it was at the beginning of time, and then everything else is causation after that. Well, nobody knows, and hopefully, we'll never really will. But there's a lot of evidence with the new physics that it's undirected, and we need to get used to that. Western culture, we grew up with, we crave certainty, and that could get us into trouble. The latest thinking that has really captured my imagination is the mathematical universe structure, the MUH. And the physical world is a mathematical structure abstract, all about relations. It goes back to relations. Nothing is anything by itself. It only comes into being through its relations with others, other things, properties. And the relations, the building blocks, which have no properties on their own. Space and time exist in this relationship. Space and time come out of math, not the other way around. All right, then the world that we live in, it starts in simple, and a simple property can quickly turn into something complex, and then that complexity can turn back into something simple. The best example in chaos theory is the dripping faucet. If you let it drip slowly, that's linear. You can predict it. And then you get to a certain point, it becomes nonlinear, it's chaotic, but there's still patterns in it. And then at another, it becomes simple again. And so that is what we are surrounded with. That is what we as human beings have got to really understand. I grew up in the time of Newton, and that was linear. And x plus y equals z, and the graph goes like that. The problem with that graph, if there's a mistake, any tiny mistake along the way, there's no way getting back to the original. So nonlinear chaos theory, the reason that's so important, it can self-correct. And that's what biology is all about. And if we didn't have that, we wouldn't be here. The other thing, then, we were talking about the edges. You have between Newton, which is the basic math we all grew up, you have one end quantum, and then relativity. You get out to these extremes. That's where the shadows, the edges are. That's where the information, that's where you really need to be paying attention. And then I love Yogi Berra. The future ain't what it used to be. And it's not. We've got to let go of certainty. We have to learn how to embrace uncertainty. And that's what this slide is about. This is, again, just going back. Lorenz is one of my favorite people. He's a guy at MIT who came up with the butterfly effect. He was a mathematician who was interested in weather patterns. He was in World War II. He was all involved with that. And he was the one who saw that a very small change in something could have a huge consequence later on. And that is what chaos is about. And but the great thing about it, chaos is really a misnomer, because in the chaos there are patterns, and patterns that we can use. And then it's, but anyway, enough of that. The other thing is the multi-universe is also something now that if you have any real rocket science physics friends, they will tell you that there's 99% chance that multi-universe, particularly level 3 and 4, are very, very real. That this moment that we have here can go into just a multitude of different ways. And so that's, and so I use the multi-universe a lot in this. And I just feel real sorry for that poor guy that has to follow me. When I make these bad decisions, I've been very lucky that the consequences so far haven't been catastrophic. But they have been catastrophic for some of me somewhere out there. So we have to be aware of that. All right, this goes back to the Stations of the Cross, and this is one of my favorite ones, and it's space and numbers involve the truth, remote from the category of causation. And what I'm getting at is Aristotle was famous for the unmoved mover. And basically, so the unmoved mover is the chimpanzee up there and he's smoking a cigarette, and that is the unmoved mover, God or whatever, and he's looking at his son being crucified. And so that's how the distance between the truth is removed from the causation. And we're all familiar with fractals, but I just bring it up again. Mandelbrot was the famous one who really came up with the term. He got it from his teaching his kid. His kid was learning Latin and fracture and so on. So it came from fractals. But fractals are really important for us to understand. It's the repetition of patterns. And from those patterns, once we start to get comfortable with them and understand that there is a pattern to all of this existence, then we can rest in it. We don't know what it is. We can't predict it all the time. But that's as close as we're ever going to get to certainty. And Mandelbrot, interestingly enough, was born in Poland but raised in France, and then ended up at IBM for many, many years, and was at IBM. All right, so these are natural fractal patterns. This is you saw this in the New York Times, this Cagel's neuroanatomy of the neurons, and it's the repetition of patterns. You can see the buds coming off, and it's the same thing as these patterns coming off the trees. Those are fractal repetition patterns, and I use them a lot in art, and all the newer artists are very much aware of this, and you'll see this a lot because the brain loves it. The brain just sucks this stuff up. And then this is reality is threaded through concealed symmetries and synchronicity, and you can see in this is that I use. You'll see these are fractal patterns, and see how they're repeated, and they'll small and they'll get bigger and bigger, and again that's all on purpose in the composition to get the brain interested. Information. In the end, life is about passing information to the next, and this goes back to Jung and the collective unconscious. And in this painting, this is an old painting where the Mayans, and he's taking the snake, which the snake is a symbol for the DNA, the ribonucleic triple helix, and he's passing it on to the wife, or it could be the other way. But so that's the kind of way I'll use these kind of images. If you just look, it just looks like some guy handing somebody a snake, but that's what it's really about, is passing DNA and information. All right, and Dr. Lee, last time we mentioned the word panpsychism, which is one of my favorite words. And again, I'm not sitting here telling you that this is all true. I mean, I'm a Hagerty and it's bull. But we get to say it anyway because I'm up here. But anyway, panpsychism means it is consciousness in all things. And that's an important concept to at least think about. Did I miss one? But anyway, and then the rhythmic dancing of the neurons is what ultimately is what our experience is. When it really comes down to it, when we're here in this room, what's really going on is this dance of our neurons and this dancing of other neurons, and we're communicating, exchanging information. And so that's what that painting's about. All right. Will to live. So we have life, and we know that that's important. And Schopenhauer is famous for the will to live. And this is, he said this: rationality doesn't make our lives superior to other life forms. To think so is pure human arrogance. Compassion is the only guarantee of morality. And I certainly believe that. And so so we have life, and how does life keep going? It goes two ways. It diversifies itself. The more diverse it is, the more the chance that life can survive or threaten, and through evolution can go back. So the more diverse it can, and then emergence, and then the more it becomes complicated, and it can be smarter about threats. However, the problem is the other side is that you can have, if it gets too successful, and we just have to look at our world human population, then it gets too successful, and then that becomes a problem. So we have an intrinsic balance, and the intrinsic balance is through, and I'll get into that, is through chromosomes, and extrinsic is with sharing of materials. But anyway, this I think is an interesting concept, and I'm not going to try to just, but I just want to introduce you to this to think about it. The Hayflick limit, a telomere is this cord that comes off of every chromosome. There are only about 50 divisions of each cell. So there's an intrinsic stop for development. And the reason is, if it wasn't, it'd be like cancer and just keep going. And then Lovnikov in 1971, he figured out why this was so important. And basically, so you got the chromosome is here, and then you have the telomere sticking on the end. And what literally happens is a DNA, an enzyme comes in and grabs on, it's a polymerase, and grabs on to the end of that telomerase, and then it replicates it. Well, guess what? It can't replicate what it's grabbed onto. So next time, it's only this long, so it grabs onto that. And so it turns out that the length of this telomere is only 50 lengths. And so when it gets up here, it has nothing left to grab onto. That's the intrinsic balance of making sure that we don't get into too much trouble with replication. All right, and then and the extrinsic is, so we don't want one life form to dominate, so that'll have diversity, complexity, and evolution. And then the bottom line is then we end up with extrinsic, the competition for resources that we're facing today, and that's why we're in so much trouble. Getting back to Jung, the other obviously a big threat is nuclear annihilation, and Jung wrote a lot about this at the end, and he thought that the world would end in 1950, and so I'm glad he was wrong about that. All right, then, and to sum it up, it really goes down to my personal feeling about this, and it's very Hindu, whatever, but Jung is this, we all have, it's very Christian as well. The present is the only reality. This moment, this instant. Yes, we may not live forever, but that's a good news because you don't have any baggage. You don't have to worry about the baggage. So, the final is that we got to learn how to embrace life, evolve, and then this is what I believe. I believe that the great pumpkin rises out of the pumpkin patch on Halloween night and flies through the air, bringing with him toys for all the children of the world. That's what I believe. What do you think? I think you have very nice eyes and that you are completely out of your mind. And this is to my loving wife, who's my muse, but anyway. So, as a special maybe treat, we have a band. It's called Postlife Crisis that Gary started, and what we're going to try to do is avoid the slide, and then we have as a special guest Dana, and so in about 10, why don't we have 10 or 5 minutes of questions and answers or whatever. And then why don't we start the band at 6:30 with Betsy? Does that sound okay? Okay, so at this point, are there any questions? Good. Then no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
Do you think the universe is a closed system?
the question is, do you think the universe is a closed system? And there's been obviously there's been a lot of study on this. And then, the point is if you fire a gun, will that bullet eventually come back and hit you in the back of the head, or does it go forever? And we used to think it was a closed system, but now there's evidence to think that there's opened. But I sure don't know the answer to that. Does anybody else want to handle that one? Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
I was curious about your daughter stabbing you in the back. Where did that come from?
It was right out of a dream, but it's just a child replacing the adult, and I don't take it personally. I think she loves me.
But you don't actually stab you in the back?
No, and not metaphorically either. No, she's been beautiful, but the idea is that and it goes back to evolution. It goes back. This generation has got to get out this concept of living forever. Of course, we all want to live for a long time and have good lives. But how can the next generation come with us being here? And there's something against, I don't want to live forever. Matter of fact, we have a song that we're working on. Gary, do you want to live forever?
I don't do.
All right, but anyway, any others? Hey, yeah.
Have any other surreal artists used dream as a sort of a jumping off point or as inspiration?
I'm sure they have, but I'm so ignorant. I spent a whole lifetime being a plastic surgeon and not studying art. And I'm all self-taught. I've never had an art lesson, and I really don't pretend to know anything about art. But somebody else might know. I'm sure there are. Okay. Okay. Well, I'm a big fan of Dali. I picked it. Ed.
Where is some of your artwork around the world?
Oh, thank you, Ed. Thank you, Ed. Ed happens to have Ed is my neighbor, and he keeps me straight. But Ed is from Delaware originally, and very successful in airplanes and so on. But he's got a house in Nantucket, and we have a gallery representation in Nantucket, and we have the show going on in New York, and then we're at the American Visionary Museum in Baltimore right now. So we're very lucky, very fortunate. So thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm Dr. John Johnson, and I'm one of the 3 original Jungian analysts in Charleston. I think there are only 3 of us now.
Well, I hope I haven't offended you. I'm glad that you hadn't walked out.
This is a brilliant lecture.
Oh,
I
God.
really wanted to thank you for it. I also wanted to say that Alvaro Arello and Sharon Martin and myself are 3 Jungian analysts. I think the only 3, and I'm the only one here right now, available to Jungian analysis to folks in this area. And this kind of thing really excites me because it's really important. The work of one's dreams and one's artwork just really touches a deep place in the unconscious and needs to be examined and acknowledged and understood.
Well, thank you for that. Okay, any other questions? Yeah, Betsy.
I'm curious about if your dreams and your artwork have the relationship with the dyslexia, and if you've done any healing through
Well,
dreams, or if there's any relationship at all.
There's a huge relationship because first, when I was growing up, I flunked out of school. It was just, how can you get a 0 on an English test? And you think I'd get something for my name, but he couldn't read my name. And so it was very frustrating and very difficult growing up, and it was isolating, lonely, and depressing. And but I have a great family. My brothers, John and I are Irish twins, and John was always beautifully dressed, and I was this guy that just he just fell off the truck. But we've always been very close, and so I always had some backup. And so I got through it. And then, lo and behold, the first time I really appreciated dyslexia was playing football. People with dyslexia have really wide range of vision. So I could sit, and I was a standing lineman or linebacker. So I could watch the quarterback and the person hiking the ball at the same time. And this in college was a huge advantage. And so I could always get a pretty good jump. And so I said, that's very weird. And then I didn't understand why other people, so I started learning more about it. But then it turns out that dyslexics have, we are good at math and I guess, would it be left brain, George? I don't know. But anyway, spatial, and not so good on the other stuff. But it really is a big advantage at this point. And when I was totally clear is when I had a secretary. Then I had all the advantages and none of the disadvantages. And then when I retired, poor Barbara said, no, I don't want to be your secretary. Okay, yes.
How does the natural world inform your philosophy? I know
Yeah, I tell you, that's a great question. And being out in nature is absolutely, I have to be out in nature a lot because for so many different reasons. But you can look at it from fractals, you can look at it from composition, you can look at it from light, you can look at it just the stories of the animal, just the narrative. And plus I'm just a much happier, saner person. And I know that's not a very elegant way to do it, but I can tell you if I didn't have nature, I'd be in real trouble. I would die in New York.
And I think our daydreaming, our imagination and our daydreaming is aroused when we're out there in nature as kids, making up what we think we're doing, playing whatever games we're playing out in nature.
Well, and the other thing, it goes back to thinking what you think. You be careful what you do with your thoughts. When I'm in nature, I really try to, like a meditation, and it's not it's a practice. Don't waste your time out there. Don't be thinking problems at the home, at the office, or whatever. Be aware of what is around you. And then everything sort of manifests itself, and be in the moment. And nature really helps you with that, obviously. I mean, that's where we are nature. I mean, we are animals. And we have to acknowledge that. And there's nothing, I'm proud of that. I mean, well. All right, how about a couple more? Yeah, Bill?
You're much more comfortable with math and physics than I am. And, I'm in the middle of a book called Sense and Sensibility, C-E-N-T-S and Sensibility, and it's subtitled, What Economists Can Learn from the Humanities. And they have an interesting phrase, which I've found elsewhere, physics envy. There are people who, and the thesis of the book is that economists are really like this. They really want to reduce
Reductionism.
Human processes to equations, whereas possibly the only way to represent them truthfully is in narratives and images.
I couldn't agree with that more. That's reductionism, and that's what this is all about.
Yeah, right.
That's what chaos, and that's why it's so important to look on the friggin' edges. Don't look at the light.
Yep.
That's not where it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, one more question, and then we're going to break, and then the band. Yes.
I'm curious too about your colors. Do they tend to stay true to the colors in your dreams?
Thank you. What about yours? I think I think so. I dream in vivid colors, and a lot of people. But that's why it's good I didn't go to art school because they would have killed me. They would have, I would have never lasted. And, but I do dream in these colors, yes. Okay, so why don't we take a break? And thank you all so much.
Y'all are swell.